Happy Pride, readers. Welcome to Pride Book Fest. I'm Steven Salvatore, they, them, and he, him. I'm the author of Can't Take That Away, and I am so excited to bring you politics and queer activism in YA. With this panel, we're going to discuss political subtext in queer narratives, how we as authors balance story, plot, and craft with the necessary political conversations taking place across all of our books. It'll also touch upon the act of writing queer stories as a form of queer activism and how queer activism plays out on the page. So with that said, let's meet our panelists.
Hello.
Hey.
I am Daniel Aleman, and I'm the author of Indivisible, which came out just a few weeks ago. And it is a story about a Mexican-American teenager living in New York City who is left to care for his young sister after his parents are taken away by immigration officials. It is a story that I would like to say has many faces to it. It is deeply emotional, but it also has so many moments of warmth and humor and a huge focus on first love and community and friendship and family.
Hi, everyone. I'm Camryn Garrett. I'm the author of Full Disclosure and Off the Record, which just came out this week or next week, or I have no concept of time. And my pronouns are she, her, and I'm super excited to be here.
Hey everyone, I'm Abdi Nazemian. My latest book is called Like a Love Story. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm so excited to be here. Like a Love Story is kind of a love story, but to me more of a love letter to the queer community, to queer activism and ACT UP. And I'm so excited for this conversation, which fits beautifully into what I'm very interested in.
Hi, I'm Jasper Sanchez. My pronouns are he, him. My book is The Unpopular Vote, which releases in about 10 days. It is about the trans son of a congressman who runs for student body president. It has been described as the West Wing meets Red, White, and Royal Blue, which I think is pretty accurate.
Love that. I personally feel honored to be here with each and every one of you. I love all of your work, your books. It's just really, really special that we get to have this conversation. So let's dive into our first question. So all of our books are incredibly different in terms of subject matter and tone, but they all touch on important political issues in different ways. And Can't Take That Away, my main character, Carrie Parker, is a genderqueer teen who deals with the world around them, perceiving them as male. So when they're cast in the lead role as Elphaba in their high school production of Wicked, they immediately face backlash from a homophobic teacher. They're kicked out of the musical and then have to find the courage to lead their friends and the rest of the school in protest against their corrupt school administration. It tackles queer activism, gender politics, and stepping into one's voice as a vocal member of the LGBTQ+ community. So if you wouldn't mind, for viewers at home, can each of you offer a short summary of your books and a bit of insight into how politics plays a role in each of those stories?
Should we go in alphabetical order?
You can go in any order you want.
It's Elphaba pun.
I love it.
So as I mentioned just a little while ago, Indivisible is a story about a Mexican-American teenager whose parents got detained by immigration authorities. And something that, is a very key aspect of Mateo's identity is that he is Mexican, he is the son of immigrants, and he is also gay. And so I feel inherently this is a political story, but really my aim and my hope with this book is not necessarily to discuss the legal and political dimensions of immigration, but rather bring a new dimension to the conversation, which is a human and compassionate lens, which particularly when it comes to immigration is something that I feel we don't get to see or talk about enough. And that is what I hope to bring to the table with this story.
In my book, Off the Record, it's about a teen journalist who wins a contest and gets to go on a press tour, and she talks about, or she gets to cover like a new up and coming actor, and then while she's on this tour, she discovers like a sexual assault scandal. So obviously I'm exploring like Me Too and a lot of discussions around that. I think one thing when I initially first wrote this that I didn't see discussed a lot was how queerness dealt with Me Too. I feel like there's a lot of like powerful men, and then everyone sort of assumed that the people they hurt were straight or, you know, sorry, I can't think, were straight basically. And I think didn't talk about the ways that like queer people were hurt by their actions as well. And that's something, not to spoil, but yeah, that's something that I tried to explore with this.
So Like a Love Story is the story of three teenagers. It takes place in New York City in 1989 and 1990 at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the US. And the story kind of sets into motion when Reza, a teenager, moves to New York with his mom, and he is closeted, carrying a lot of shame from living in a culture that literally doesn't have a word for homosexuality at that point. And you know, lands at the height of the epidemic. And then he meets two other teenagers, Judy, who's an aspiring fashion designer, and Art, who's the only out kid at the high school. And kind of a love triangle forms. But more importantly for me, it's a mentorship story too, because Judy's uncle is an ACT UP activist living with HIV/AIDS, and his best friend Jimmy is too. And these two men become mentors to these three kids as they introduce them to activism, to the power of the queer community and self-acceptance. So it is, yeah, I mean, the book is quite political because it's about politics, and that's it.
So as I mentioned, The Unpopular Vote is about a trans boy who is the son of a congressman. The congressman represents a pretty liberal district in Northern California, but despite that, he's not accepting of his son's identity. And so they have this deal where Mark and his mom can move 40 miles north, and as long as Mark is stealth at his new school and doesn't tell anyone he's trans, he can live as a boy. He just can't mention he's related to his dad either. And he's supposed to be keeping a low profile. But when he witnesses this incident of homophobic bullying and the student body president candidates take bad positions, the administration also participates in victim blaming, he decides that he can't just stand on the sidelines and needs to get involved. So there are a lot of layers in terms of dealing with queer and trans issues, both in general and at the school level, but it's also sort of wrapped up in this satire of the American electoral system as well.
What I think is really interesting in just hearing, everybody's summaries of their books and the topics that, come up in each of your stories is that, there's so much that revolves around identity. And I always struggle with identity being politicized. I think that we all probably have these moments of just sheer frustration and emotional, turmoil and breakdown over the fact that so much of the queer identity is politicized all the time, and, intersectional identity as well. So that sort of like ties into my next question. So in Can't Take That Away, Carrie, my main character, says, "It's unfair that politics seek to politicize my identity because this is my life and I'm not up for debate." And as I was reading Daniel's Indivisible, Mateo says something really similar. The context is completely different because it's really in relation to his family's immigration status compared to his friends' families. But when Mateo said, "My side has always been different. It's one where my family and I have always had to be careful. One where our existence has always been up for debate, where my dreams are less valid, no matter how hard I might be willing to work to achieve them. So this concept of being up for debate has existed in US political discourse for queer folks, especially for queer people of color, for as long as the US has been a damn country. So is this something that you as a writer think about when crafting narratives for young adults specifically?
Absolutely. And I think that this was one of the key questions that I wanted to explore through Mateo. He, as I mentioned, lives at the intersection of being the son of immigrants and being gay. And he at times, doesn't feel Mexican enough. He doesn't feel American enough. And it was just really, really important for me to show also that there may not even be clear-cut answers to these questions of identity, of feeling like the other, of feeling like you're up for debate. And it's something that we each need to grapple with in our own ways. And perhaps we will find answers and perhaps we won't. And that is kind of the journey that Mateo goes through. And I think it's just really important to, first of all, ask ourselves these questions so that we're able to kind of come to terms with it and kind of discover our own identities separate from the pressure and the expectations that other people place on us.
I think about this a lot because I remember in high school, there was only one Black teacher that I had, and I was super, super into him because he was the only one who really acknowledged the racism that we as Black students dealt with. But I remember talking to him about Moonlight, and he said, people only care about that because it's gay. Like, when a Black thing is gay, it's a little different. And I think about that a lot still now, because he basically said when there's a story about a Black queer person, it's not fully Black. And I think making my characters queer, I want to remind people that you don't have to choose. Like, if you have multiple identities, you don't have to choose one. And being queer doesn't make you less Black, and being Black doesn't make you less queer. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's not explicitly discussed in the book, but I think all of those different identities intersect and clarify who you are. And I don't think you can just pull one out.
Absolutely. That's one thing that I love about Josie and Off the Record is that there's these little moments where she talks about her crush, and I'm blanking on her crush's name right now. Forgive me. But I just then I was time. I'm like, wait, what did I name that person in my own story?
I always name, I hope I always name the distant girl crush Sarah, because I had a crush on a girl named Sarah in high school. So I'm always was it Sarah? What did I change it to and edit?
I love that. But I love that you did, it's those little moments of hinting at the grayness that is the queer identity, right? It's and I feel like there's so much in online discourse that is you have to define yourself very clearly. You have to be this or this. And there's not a whole lot in between. And I love those little moments in your book. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on anybody else's toes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, everything that everyone's saying is resonating so much, because being Iranian and gay, I mean, truthfully, for a long time, I didn't feel like I was up for debate. I just feel like I didn't exist, or I couldn't exist because there were no examples. There was no example of a Middle Eastern queer person that I could turn to either in my life or in media representation. I mean, the first book I wrote, I believe, was the first book ever to have a lead character who was a gay Iranian, which is nuts. I mean, one of the reasons the book is a big homage to Madonna, the title is Like a Love Story, is because, when she went on her Blonde Ambition tour in the whole Vogue era, which many of us are familiar with, it was the first time I saw queer men of color being celebrated. One of them was named Salim. I knew that at the time. I didn't know where he was from, but he looked like he could be one of us. And it was a huge thing for me that not only could I exist, but I could exist and be best friends with the woman I most wanted to be best friends with. Never happened, but yeah. And then once I came out, there was still so much struggle. And honestly, there still is between, the values of the Iranian community and the values of the queer community. And those are often at odds. And I've always wanted to be, you know, explicitly and loudly queer. And I also love Iranian culture and love my family and culture of origin and want to pass that down to my kids. And they don't always come together. And so that's something that I have to hold. And when I talk to other, you know, intersectional queer people, just really making sure that it's okay to be a part of different communities that don't always align perfectly.
So before this panel, I was scrolling through Instagram, as one does. And I came across a post tracking the current number of anti-trans bills in state legislatures. And I believe the number was 150. The math that I'm about to do doesn't add up, because I think it said 75 anti-trans sports bills and 40 anti-trans healthcare bills. Maybe there are some others thrown in there as well. But I think it was 150. And so this question is really interesting in after reading that, because, you know, trans issues, trans people, especially trans kids, are literally up for debate all across the country right now. And that's something that's, you know, always on my mind. And I wasn't planning on talking about it, but as I was listening to all this, I was thinking about this scene in my book where my protagonist talks about, you know, really wanting to love this country because, you know, he's grown up immersed in politics, like wants to go into politics, and I mean, wants to do activism, and like ultimately believes in the system at the beginning, or is trying to believe in the system. But, you know, I don't talk about the anti-trans bills, but it's, you know, he exists in this culture where he knows that his identity is up for debate. And so he's really grappling with this idea of, you know, I want to love this country, but how do I do that if it doesn't love me back? And so one of my favorite lines in the book actually comes in that scene. And he says something like, you know, when you're queer in America, you have to learn to love your country for what it could be, or not at all. I'm butchering my own favorite quote here, but yeah, so I'm definitely always keenly aware of the politicization of our identities, you know, queer, trans, and otherwise, because, you know, like the personal is always political, even when we really wish it wasn't.
Yeah, that's very powerful, and I think all the time, you know, why do we have to learn to love what is, you know, I don't know. I struggle with that, right? Like we have to see things for what they could be as opposed to like what they are right now. But if we don't see things for what they are right now and address how they are right now, how are we ever going to get to the place where we can, the things that we see or the things that we think could be, could actually come true? I don't know if any of what I just said made sense, because it made sense as I was processing it, but I don't know if it flew out of my mouth properly. But that it makes me think of, you know, Abdi, what you said about like not feeling like you existed at all versus, you know, feeling like, you know, your existence is up for debate. And I think about this all the time because there's this discourse, right, that happens especially with queer books and books from writers of color as well, that, you know, there needs to be this balance between joy and pain, and like how do you come up with that balance? And I often feel like it's a false binary. It's like you either have joy or you have pain, and there's not like, there can't be a mix of the two in there, because really what's at the intersection of that is the politicization of queerness. Maybe this stems from like an overabundance of queer trauma stories, but the one thing that I keep coming back to is like, how do we know and understand joy without experiencing that hardship. Like I think, I don't know, it's like my academic writer brain. Like I don't know, I can't necessarily envision joy without knowing what I have to compare it to. So like I think about how my book is like one of the first young adult books with a first person genderqueer main character, which then makes it inherently political, regardless of the fact that there's actually activism in the book. And, you know, then it's like there's expectations from straight cis readers that, you know, they expect this to be one thing. So I don't know, as writers of young adult books, we have to consider age demographics, right? And as queer writers, we have to consider queer readers of all ages and their expectations and the expectations by straight audiences. So I don't know, how do reader expectations play a role in your writing process? How do you balance joy with the harder topics? Because we all touch on pretty hard stuff in our books.
I would say that reader expectations, I try to block them out as much as possible, and I try to be as authentic as I can be. Because if I'm, you know, trying to please someone or another, it's not going to be what I want to say. And as long as I am putting on the page what I wanted to say, then I feel like half my work is done. And also, I would say that my favorite queer stories are the ones that show queer characters as all that they are, that show queer characters as complex. And complexity means addressing a whole spectrum of emotions and a whole spectrum of experiences. And yes, the pain, and yes, the, you know, rejection and the challenges, and also our dreams and our ambitions, and you know, all of the joy and happiness that can come from, you know, queer experiences. And so that is something that I really tried to do in Indivisible, just not shy away from the difficult stuff, but also really place importance on the good stuff. And I think that those are, you know, the best books, the ones that address that complexity.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this, and also like a love story, because I feel like my first book, full disclosure, was like in conversation with it almost before I even like knew that you're writing it. Because my first book, full disclosure, is about a teen girl who's HIV positive, and she has queer dads. And I think I felt like I was primarily writing it for queer people, especially queer teens. So it was weird when people who aren't queer were saying something. Just, I don't know if I'm answering the question specifically, but like people would say like there are no straight people in this book, and I was like, I wasn't thinking about that. Do you know what I mean? And also like, why is it relevant? But full disclosure specifically, and off the record, because they're both about like their issue books. And I think what would be kind of frustrating sometimes is because people would see like an issue, and then when I'd get like interviews or something, people would always be like, let's talk about this tough issue, and this is such a heavy book. And I was like, it doesn't feel heavy to me because it feels like there's such a mix. Do you know what I mean? And I feel like especially when there are topics that impact queer people, they automatically get labeled as heavy or inspirational, or I'm trying to think of something else, like powerful. And those are all great things, but I feel like sometimes we're not allowed to have like that complexity and like be multiple things. I don't know if that made sense.
That makes so much sense. I mean, I feel like I'll just say a version of that, but like, I mean, in terms of reader expectations for the first part of the question, I would say I also don't. I think to write with reader expectations in mind would be a very like dangerous game to play with your creativity, because there's so much self-editing that would come into the process, and you really have to be true to the voices that are speaking to you when you're writing. But I also do think that in the editing process, I leave myself open to that, whether it's some, you know, advice I'm getting from my editor or through sensitivity reads, which I'm sure we've all had. And I definitely feel like I try very hard to listen and learn in that process, not to please readers, but to present a story that feels as empathetic toward the characters that I want it to be, because I really believe we have to have empathy for our characters. But yeah, in terms of, I just agree so much. And it's something I'm so passionate about, is like, we can't create like this binary between joy and pain, as if like human emotion can be put in a box. I just think it's silly. I get really upset when I've heard it so many times on panels, like a version of like, can't we move past queer trauma, or can't we move past like the gay characters dying? And I'm like, well, I was raised at a time when there was a disease that was killing us in droves. I come from a country where you can get killed for being gay. Like it kind of feels like deeply hurtful to hear that some people are overhearing about gay trauma and gay death when I've been surrounded by it my whole life. And even now, when I talk about this in the author's note of Like a Love Story, like, beyond the fact that HIV/AIDS are still very prevalent in this country and around the world, beyond the fact that there's violence against so many members of our community, there's also like so many friends I know who are dying of overdose, of suicide. Like there's an epidemic of shame in our community, and shame is something that we can carry for so long that doesn't heal. And it's just like, I just think it's very presumptuous for people to tell us to put our pain in a box. Like I love joy. Like I feel like my book is about a very painful time, but it's also full of music and joy and connection and laughter and camp. And like, I love that about the queer community, that we find joy in pain. But I think to tell us to set the pain aside or to be done with it is very, very wrong.
Yeah, I absolutely feel that. And I think a lot of what these conversations about reader expectations come down to is sort of these logical fallacies. And Steven, you mentioned one of them, which is this false binary between suffering and joy. Again, and as you've all said, as if those two things can't exist at once. And then I think there's also this this false issue that really comes down to marketing between issues books and non-issues queer books, which is kind of funny to me personally, because the books that we think of as like light and fluffy queer books, none of them are 100% light and fluffy. Like every queer YA I've read still deals with some pretty serious stuff. A lot of them have like outing or blackmail or a variety of things. And I'm not saying this to like pull those books out and say that they're not good, light, fluffy reads, because, they're full of joy. I love them. But it's really interesting that they get marketed as being super light and fluffy, as opposed to issues books when they're still dealing with heavy things. And this was really interesting to me, drawing this back to my own process, because I wrote The Unpopular Vote without any expectation of publication. It was kind of an experiment for me because I'd never written YA before. So I was just writing what I wanted to write. And I thought, I sort of naively thought that it was like a pretty serious book because it's dealing with, like really serious transphobia. And, there's now an excerpt up of the first two chapters online. And at the end of the second chapter, there's someone drowns in blood. I don't think of it as a light read. So I've been really surprised to see it. Maybe I'm revealing some dark industry secrets here. But I've been sort of surprised to see it marketed as being pretty light and fluffy. And so it's something I worry about. Are readers going to read my book with the expectation that it's something that it's not? And I don't know, it's really easy to get in your own head. But at the same time, one of the best compliments I've ever received from anyone is from a writer friend who told me that what she appreciated about this book was like my ability to like balance like heavy issues with like queer joy. And I was like, wow. And that was, long before we ever talked about this panel. And it was just such like, a nice thing to hear. Because I like the idea of being able to do that. I like that we're all talking about doing that, and that there are so many books that do manage to do that.
I just want to also say, because everything you said resonates so much, but maybe there's some hope that like some people based on that marketing would read the book that wouldn't, and then be pleasantly surprised by what they find. Because I will say a lot of people, and I'm one of those crazy people who reads my own reviews and looks at tweets and stuff, but like a lot of people have commented about my book being like, I thought it was a love story. I thought it was a romance. And then they like get this like long book about queer activism and HIV AIDS, but they tend in some cases to be happily surprised. And so it's like you know, I think sometimes maybe I was not involved in the marketing at all, but it's like, there's something to that as well. Like offering people something they think they want, but then giving them a little bit more.
I find that interesting, actually, because I think of the title Like a Love Story. And I guess it's easy to judge a book by its title. It has love story in the title, but it also has like a in there. So it's like, if you pair that with the summary, you pretty much know what you're gonna get. I've experienced this something similar to what Jasper experienced with the Unpopular Vote, where a lot of readers, you know, because of the marketing of Can't Take That Away, thought that they were getting something fluffy and, you know, cute and like, oh, it's gonna be all about how this, you know, genderqueer teen plays Elphaba in Wicked, and that's it. And it's like, but if you read past like the second sentence of the description, it literally says a homophobic teacher kicks them out of the play and then they have to rally the school in protest. So, you know, it's hard. It's hard to swallow sometimes, because I also read reader reviews and I'm trying not to do that, and because it's harmful to my mental health.
Just stop. Don't do it, please.
I'm trying. Everyone says the same thing. Just don't do it. Stay away from that. So I'm gonna do my best.
I don't understand, like, I don't know if this is like a weird or problematic thing to say, but I do feel like if you have certain people with certain marginalizations, even if it is a fluffy book, there's still going to be some shit. Can I curse?
Yeah, yeah.
There's still going to be some shit. No, but like, for real, if you're moving through the world as a genderqueer person, like, sadly, there's still stuff you're going to have to deal with. And like, if you're moving through the world as a trans person, there's stuff you're going to like, even if it's just a romance or like it's a fluffy book, like there's stuff you have to deal with. And I guess I totally understand wanting sort of like an escape from the real world, but I don't think that we should have to like water down our experiences or censor our experiences in order to fit that. And it does feel kind of icky to me that people would say, I don't think a book about AIDS, HIV, you know, like is important. Like it feels really icky to me that people are like, I don't want this book because it's not happy. And it's like a book exploring like really important topics. Yeah.
It's sort of like that argument that like, oh, because of, you know, like in 2015 when marriage equality happened, right, and became legal, that there was this like weird, and I think it still prevails now, there's this weird sense of like, oh, LGBTQ rights are no longer an issue overall, and there's nothing else that we need to worry about ever again. And then it's like, okay, that whitewashes the entire AIDS crisis, and it just and it hinges every bit of queer equality and equity on one thing that happened, just for like for the sake of a ring and a piece of paper. Not to downplay that, because that was important to me, but it's like you can't ignore everything that came before in favor of something that maybe feels utopic, but we know from what's happened between then and now that we are far from a utopia. Like,
I mean, so looping back to what Camryn said just a minute ago and something Abdi said a while ago about, well, I mean, it's about all of this. I think it's, you know, it goes back to another logical fallacy, you know, the scarcity issue that always comes up in queer representation. And people feeling like, if we can only have so many stories, then yeah, we're done with the death and the dying. We don't want the depressing stuff. Give us the fluffy stuff, just romances that sanitize the pain. We don't need to talk about that. But it's a logical fallacy. There can be light, fluffy stories that de-emphasize, trying to say this in a way that's like not negative about like light, fluffy stories. Light and fluffy stories are nice. I like picking up romance novels that don't have homophobia in them. That's nice. I also read serious books. And that's my entire point. We can have it all. I guess it comes down to, actually, it loops back to reader expectations or reader wants and desires. As long as there's a demand for both kinds of stories, and therefore publishing sees that readers want both kinds of stories, then we don't have to say that we're moving past one kind or the other. And even as I'm talking about this, I'm realizing I'm playing into the binary again of suffering versus joy. But I'm really just trying to say we can have all the stories.
We should have every story.
I think like this is slightly off topic, but what I get frustrated when people are like, I want to move past coming out stories, or like the stories where like you discover your sexuality, because I honestly still have no clue. I thought I was so sure that I was bi, and now I'm like, maybe I'm a lesbian, and like, but I think it's kind of frustrating to think that it's like sort of a open and shut thing, and that immediately, and then it never comes back again. But yeah, that was my take.
Absolutely. I agree. And, something that really resonates with me is just like the ever-changing, ever-evolving fluidity of identity. And sometimes you're not sure. Sometimes you're still questioning. And, it touches on, I think, the theme of this particular panel. And sometimes like you walk out into the world and you have to come out to people every day or every so often, not in non-pandemic times, because maybe we don't go out as often anymore. But like in normal times, it's like sometimes we have to, come out in small ways. And that is an inherently political act. And so sometimes it really is hard to separate that as writers when we're exploring stuff on the page and our characters. One thing that I think is that I love about queer stories, because I kind of want to like dive just a bit into joy before we get into even more like darker stuff, is the trope of found family. And I think Jasper's book does this really well, bringing found family into like political spaces. So what are the ways in which you've woven aspects of found family into your stories, and how does this speak to queer narratives and queer experiences, and also like the politics of being queer?
So I guess I can start. So the found family aspect in the Unpopular Vote came about in sort of a weird way. In the book, basically, all these kids are part of the school's French club. And they were all friends before joining the French club, but none of them were out. And they had this, the backstory is they had this co-ed, moderately drunken sleepover, and sort of all ended up coming out to each other. I actually wrote this before I wrote the book. I might someday release it as like a bonus scene. Anyway, they've all been like out as queer since. They're all great friends. They end up campaigning together. It's great. And the inspiration for that was actually real life. I was the president of my school's French club. Do not ask me to speak any French. I've forgotten all of it, except the small bits that appear in the book, I guess. But, I was in high school I graduated in 2010, which I probably shouldn't be saying because I'm just making myself feel old. But you know, I'm from Northern California, liberal suburb. Nobody was out in that era, or at least not until senior year, when this guy that I had actually sort of dated, who I really hope isn't watching this, came out as gay, and he was the only one at the time. And he was totally accepted, and I'm getting vaguely off track here. But the point is, in the 5 years after high school, everyone who was in French Club and sort of that greater friend group came out as some kind of queer. Like almost everyone is bi. My absolute best friend from high school is gay, and didn't tell me for another 3 years. And I was out as a lesbian during that time, and then came out as trans and bi later. And so it was really interesting to me the way that all worked out, and the fact that I had found this queer family before any of us actually knew we were queer. And since then, making new friends in other spaces in my life, they've always been majority queer friend groups, and more recently, majority trans friend groups even. So I can't really imagine existing as the token queer or token trans person in anyone's friend group. So I can't imagine writing that. It's always going to be found queer family for me. And I know that's a political act. But it's an easy choice for me to make personally when writing.
You know what's interesting too, right? And just to remix this question a little bit is, I think found family can sometimes play out in different ways too, not just with queer identities, but specifically I'm thinking Daniel in Indivisible, Mateo has a found family in his community that sort of rallies around him and his sister after his parents are detained. And I think that's really, and then obviously there's Adam, and that whole thing, which is I don't know how much to spoil or not spoil. So I'll just let you talk about that. What do you think, Daniel?
Of course. Well, I love stories about found family, and like you mentioned, I think there is a big component of Mateo having his two best friends in the world who are his biggest support, and one of them is gay, Adam. And then there's this other component of finding found family in your community. And one of the things that is interesting about Indivisible, when I was writing it, I put a lot of pieces of myself on the page, and I didn't really realize just how much or how personal I'd gotten until I went back and I was editing, and I realized that a major theme is, learning how to ask for help when you need it. And sometimes it's so easy as queer people, or as intersectional queer people, it can be super difficult to speak up and to, ask for help and to say, hey, I need a hand. And that is one of the main themes that I wanted to explore. And it's a book about, finding solace in the most unexpected of places and realizing that you're not alone and that you have the ability to speak up and to use your own voice and ask for help, and that help is available in your community, in your friendships, in the most unexpected of places sometimes.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add, because I think Like a Love Story is also a story about found family in many ways. It's about these three teenagers who form an incredible bond and are there for each other in ways that in each case their family of origin can't be. And that's very much true to my own experience of loving and being very close to my family, but also knowing that there's a certain level of acceptance and mirroring of my experience that they're never going to be able to give me. And the other piece that is very important to me in there is that it's an intergenerational found family, and that there are queer mentors in there as well. And I am very passionate about having a dialogue between the generations and having it be an empathetic one of understanding that we all queer people are not raised in the same era in the same country. We have different experiences based on that. And You know, if you want to feel old, write a book set in the 80s about your childhood and have it marketed as historical fiction. That will make you feel old. You suddenly, I'm like, what? I'm like, but it is something history is something I'm very passionate about. And especially given that we have elders among us, people who have been through so much, I'm just very passionate about making sure that our found families include them.
Yeah, I definitely, it's not so much in my second book, but in my first book, definitely thinking about like elders or just people who are older than me. Because when I was researching, full disclosure, a lot of people my own age didn't know that there was an AIDS crisis, and didn't know what ACT UP was. And it was very interesting because like my school is in the village. So like, it was just so weird to be in that space and have people not know what it was. But then at the same time, like there were older queer people who obviously had lived through this. And I think it was just such an interesting experience to sit down with people and talk about this stuff that like you're not there for. I'm not even on the question, but yeah, it just was really, really interesting for me because I honestly hadn't known a lot about queer activism. And so to be able to talk to people about that, I think is like so affirming to know like, you know, we've always been here and people have always been fighting. Yeah.
I think there's something so powerful about finding your community, finding the people that you can connect with, who understand who you are, what you're going through, and even if they don't, are willing to learn, and that you are willing to learn from, right? Because I think that's part of, you know, being queer is learning about our history, learning about the things that happened before, because like we're in all different age brackets in this conversation, and I think it's always very fascinating to me because I learn most from, I volunteer at one of my local LGBTQ centers. And when I get to actually speak to some of the seniors, and I taught a senior memoir writing class, and, you know, to know that they were like my age during the AIDS crisis, and that they were closeted and married, and, you know, just like the fear that was like running through them, and really getting to experience hearing those stories, I think is invaluable for queer folks. And I think it's an important part of like learning who we are and just learning our place in the world. You know, like we've all mentioned, like our books cover a wide array of political discussions, but Abdi's Like a Love Story, for me, when I read that a couple of years ago, I was changed by it because it was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. And I just loved the balance of the intersecting stories between Reza, Judy, and Art, the fear of coming out, coming of age during, you know, such a really scary time, you know, for queer people. So my question is for you, Abdi, and for everybody else, like, how do you balance telling a compelling story while also making sure to give queer teens the tools and information that they need in order to be informed? What is our job as writers, especially for writers of young people?
Wow. I mean, first and foremost, I think our job is to tell the truth, you know, whatever that means to us, and to be as honest as possible. And I think that that's what I was trying to do in this book is, you know, be as honest as possible to the experience that I had, to what the emotions of that time were, you know. And yes, there was a lot of fear and shame, but one of the reasons it was so fun to write it in 3 or really 4 perspectives, because there's these note cards woven throughout that are written by Uncle Steven, is that it allowed me to embody different responses to the crisis and to the experience. And I really believe that there's not one way to be queer. It's like coming out is right for some people and it's not right for others. There's a lot of circumstances, there's a lot of cultural elements, you know. We can be activists in different way. Like I'm very much of a Reza. Like I tend to like sometimes like take time to do things, or like my form of activism is in writing behind the safety of a computer, whereas like getting to write a character like Art, who was so full of rage and led with that, like was really liberating for me. It's not who I am, but I have always been attracted to people like that. And it was so much fun to get to write, you know, that rage and that anger and that spirit. And I don't know, I suppose like, you know, to tell the truth, to show people different ways. I mean, in my case, there were different perspectives in one book, but even if the book has one perspective, I think stories offer young people roadmaps of who they might be. And I know for myself, like when I was young and I didn't have a lot of like queer mentors, if any, like, you know, storytelling was how I was like, oh, that's a version of who I can be, or that's a version. And so I think that's what we're doing. We're offering people, you know, the gamut of human experience, and hopefully they find kernels in our stories that help them form their own identities over time.
Yeah, I think, oh my God, sorry, Daniel, okay, sorry. I was gonna say, I definitely agree. And I just remember like being in my school library reading books by queer authors, like about queer people, and being like, wow, this isn't like a abstract thing. Like I just remember reading The Miseducation of Cameron Post, and it was like super meta because we have the same name. But just, I think like starting to see myself in stories like that was super helpful, because I wasn't really having these discussions like with my parents, or I didn't really know any queer adults in my life. So I think being that presence for like teens who don't have that in their actual lives is super important.
And I loved what you said, Abdi, about, you know, our role as writers is to tell the truth. And I think that that is the most important thing we can do, and sometimes the only thing we can do, because I speak for myself when I say I don't write, you know, with the intention of teaching somebody something. I don't set out with the intention of telling you how to think or telling you how to see something. I set out to write from the most honest place that I can. And I like the idea of readers, especially young readers, who are determining how they view their world and who are still, you know, understanding their identities and how they fit into their communities. For them to just take this story and make of it what they need it to be, you know, and take bits and pieces of it and decide if it serves their worldview and if it serves the way that they want to, you know, understand themselves and understand their surroundings. And that is, I think, something really special that we can do, and that a very special role that we got to play as writers for young people.
I'm going to tackle this with an anecdote about what not to do. And I'm going to start with what both Abdi and Daniel said about telling the truth. Steven, during one of your launch events, you talked about the best piece of writing advice you ever received, which is like, if you get stuck, it's because you've told yourself a lie somewhere. And I messaged you after that and was like, oh my God, this seems really relevant to this project that I'm working on, the project that was supposed to be my second book. And I was trying to figure out, okay, where is the lie in what I was working on? And I never quite figured it out, or it took me a while to figure it out. But like, as I'm sitting here, it completely makes sense. Because my issue with the second book is that I was starting from a place of instruction rather than story. I had the politics figured out. I knew exactly what message I wanted to convey. And it was kind of going to be an instruction manual, like even in terms of how I was going to structure it for teens to, you know, read about the kind of activism. I mean, I guess I can just say it was about like unionizing and organizing, which is really cool. And I'd still like to write a book about that someday, but not the book I was going to write. And it was like, I thought it would be really cool for teens to get a book like that, because I don't think there's one out there right now, or at least not a queer one. So I knew that was something I wanted teens to have, but the story wasn't there. And so every time I tried to work on it, I just didn't know what story I was telling. So now I'm going to butcher some classic media theory here. The medium is the message. I was so caught up in like the message of the politics and the activism, but I forgot that we're using novels as the medium. And the message is completely irrelevant if we screw up the novel writing aspect of it. If we don't have a story, then if we don't have a story that's full of heart and that's compelling and engaging to readers and also to us as writers to keep us writing and finish the damn thing, then the message is completely irrelevant.
I love that. That is really great advice for any writer out there who is listening. I think that's something that that I maybe at one point we all are confronted with. Like, what is the message, and how do I not let that interfere with the story, or how do I, allow the story to unfold and allow the message to get folded in as I write naturally in a way that comes out, that makes more sense. Yeah, I love that. Great advice. Camryn, I want to talk a little bit about Off the Record, because I think I haven't finished it yet. I'm so close to the end. But I came across this chapter yesterday and I was just like, oh my God. So in Off the Record, there's this passage where Josie is sort of like in her head ruminating on the actions of problematic filmmakers and the discussion about separating art from artist. And Josie says, sexually abusing someone is different from cheating on a wife or rapping sexist lyrics. Sexual assault is a gigantic display of power. It's someone's way of saying, I'm doing this to you because we both know you can't do anything to stop it. How do I fight against that? I don't know if I can. Survivors are all around and their pain is real, so vivid that I can't pretend it isn't there. I thought that entire chapter was really, really powerful, and it resonated so deeply on so many levels. And I want to talk about, I don't want to necessarily talk about like separating problematic, people and art from artists, but I think that so often like marginalized folks are dehumanized and reduced to their silence, reduced solely to their identities, and pushing back against systems of oppression is then labeled a political act, not a human act or like a call for empathy, compassion, and justice like it should be. So my question for you and for all of the authors is, as queer writers, how do we write about systems of oppression that try to keep people silenced or sanitized or stereotyped without it becoming a political statement? And is that even possible?
I don't necessarily know if that's possible. I feel like it becomes political. I think Jasper said the personal becomes political even when we don't necessarily want it to. Because even I was speaking with my friend and we were discussing that we want to try to book about colorism within the Black community. And she was saying it would be more radical just to write a romance. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, because I wanted to write sort of like Moxie book where like they're running around and like putting up posters and things like that. And she was saying, I mean, if you have like a darker Black girl who is loved, like despite the way she looks, then it's political. And so I feel like even just having like certain characters be at the center of stories as a political action. And I feel personally that I don't think I can avoid it because of all of my identities.
So, okay, I'm just going to go full media scholar on this. There is, a great debate about whether all art is inherently political, regardless of whether it's about politics, regardless of whether it deals with, marginalization or anything. Just, is art political? Or is it possible to just have art for art's sake? For a lot of reasons. I fall on the side of the argument that all art is political in some way. Every narrative choice we make is political, whether we think it is or not. And that's connected to what Camryn's saying in terms of, who we're casting as a love interest. We are choosing to show someone as desirable that other media doesn't deem desirable. Or, going back to some of what we were talking about earlier, if you choose to write a lighter, fluffier, queer rom-com sort of contemporary, but where there's less homophobia or something, that's a political choice. There's value in all of these choices. I think the most important thing is being aware of the fact that the choices that we make are political. They do have meaning, and just being aware of that. And again, I feel like I'm only thinking of things that I've done wrong in my books, in terms of times I tried to use identities very intentionally in books to make particular political statements, purposely not using specifics because I don't want to indict myself here. And then, sensitivity readers saying, okay, maybe not that. Maybe don't do that. And it's just, I think at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to say is I don't think it's inherently bad that our political statements or that our writing against political systems of oppression become political statements, because silence or ignoring those is also a political statement. Just going to cite another scholar here, but The History of Sexuality, Volume 1 by Michel Foucault literally talks about silence as a political thing in queer history. So,
yeah, I also would side with the all art is political argument. And I think sometimes it's political, kind of capital P political, and sometimes maybe it's lowercase p, but art is culture. Culture is in dialogue with identity, politics, with all of it. And I think in my college days, in my academic days, I wrote about everything from Archie comics to Basic Instinct in political ways, right? But I also think one thing that's interesting to me when you ask that question that came up is how I feel like we've also lost the thread of what the process of making art is for the artist. And I know for me, I'm not somebody who plots my books or plans my books. And A Love Story is a book that completely came out of me in a very mysterious, transcendental way, and feels like it then touched a piece of me and now has touched readers. And I feel like there's this strange idea that people seem to have accepted as fact now, that every work of art is somehow completely representative of the artist. And it's sometimes I think the artist is a vessel. And I don't know if you'll humor me, because this is something I think about nonstop since I work in media. And one of my favorite humans is Nick Cave, who's, for those who don't know, is a singer and writer, and he does everything. But he has this thing called the Red Hand Files, where people can send him questions. And the last question that he got was about separating art from the artist. And I won't read the whole letter, but I did pull it up because I felt like it was so thought-provoking and made me think of it in a different way. But he says, I don't think we can separate the art from the artist, nor should we need to. I think we can look at a piece of art as the transformed or redeemed aspect of an artist and marvel at the miraculous journey that the work of art has taken to arrive at the better part of the artist's nature. Perhaps beauty can be measured by the distance it has traveled to come into being. That bad people make good art is a cause for hope. To be human is to transgress, of that we can be sure, yet we all have the opportunity for redemption, to rise above the more lamentable parts of our nature, to do good in spite of ourselves, to make beauty from the unbeautiful, and have the courage to present our better selves to the world. And I feel like there's something there that speaks to this idea that like art travels through us. It travels through people, but it's, I don't know, for me, like art's always been my religion. Like I was raised without religion and like I turned to the arts. And so like, I'm also very interested in having that discussion, the discussion of like, how is art even created? Who does it choose to come through? Does it belong to anybody? Like, and I think those are like huge questions that we can spend hours and hours on, but I'll stop there.
We're gonna make that another panel topic for 2022, a whole art versus artists. I love that. That's amazing.
I would love that. Sign me up for that panel next year. I mean, I fully agree with everything everyone has said. And I've been thinking about how I conceived the idea for Indivisible, because I knew I wanted to write a book about family separation. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about immigration. And, you know, that is inherently political. And at the same time, I asked myself, what angle am I going to come at this, you know, from? And I didn't, you know, in this book, you're not going to find a discussion of policy. You're not going to find a discussion of political parties. And that was a conscious choice that I made because I wanted to focus on the human side of immigration. And as much as I wanted to, you know, talk about the real life consequences that human beings experience as a result of a flawed immigration policy, and as human as I wanted to make this book, it is ultimately still a political book. And my decision to also make Mateo, the main character, gay is also a political decision in and of itself. So I fully agree that art is inherently political, even if we as the artists may not want it to be. It is, especially coming from queer writers, especially coming from intersectional writers.
I love that. I completely agree. You know, one thing that I think is really interesting in this conversation, right? When we talk about such heavy issues and intersecting identities and all of these very political statements and choices that we're making, even if we're not actively thinking about it, because it's just flowing through us, it's coming out in the art that we're creating because of who we are and our identities. You know, whether or not fiction can actually bring about social change, like how far do books and stories go? Is it possible to expect change from queer literature, or is queer literature the change?
That's super deep. I have to think about that.
I think that was Jasper. Actually, I stole it and through the email that we exchanged. So we're gonna give Jasper credit for that one.
I can tell you why I asked that question. So that was sort of my primary focus or research area in grad school, because I was going to be an academic for a while. And ironically, it was a question I asked myself about my academic writing as well. I was researching, I was in a media studies program. I was researching sort of representation studies in queer representation in science fiction television, mainly, and looking at that as a potential for showing other worlds and other ways of being, the fact that reality is contingent, you can have different social structures, and how does that potentially inspire viewers to challenge their own perceptions? How does that affect the real world? And so I was sitting there watching these TV shows and, writing my academic papers and telling myself, well, this fiction has the power to change the world, and me writing about it also, my academic writing therefore also has the power to change the world. And And then I got over that and told myself, no, I'm going to just go write fiction because that's what I want to do anyway. And, you know, I'm still thinking about those same questions, but just applied to my own work. So to answer the second part of the question, is queer literature the change? It is certainly a change. Queer literature is important. Representation is important. We talked about this earlier. I mean, Camryn, you talked about reading The Miseducation of Camryn Post and you know, seeing parts of yourself. Actually, ironically, same. I was in college when I read Camryn Post, and I think it was one of the first lesbian books I'd ever read when I was coming to terms with the fact that I liked girls, which was a thing I had to come to terms with. And it reminds me of another piece of theory, which is something that I sort of tried to address in my book, or at least you'll see it in the acknowledgements. I try to talk about the fact that there's a difference between knowing things exist and knowing that there are possibilities for you personally. And we all have ideas of sort of the constellation of possibilities that exist for us personally. That's created by, you know, a variety of socioeconomic factors. And, you know, all of our different identities and marginalizations play into this. And so part of where my book came from is this experience of growing up, white, sort of upper middle class in this very suburban part of California that's very liberal. You know, if you look at the polling or voting results, it's always like 70 to 80% for every Democratic candidate down the ballot. Being in that kind of place and with the kind of media that existed in the early 2000s, I knew what LGBT meant, maybe less on the trans side of things, but I knew about LGBT identities. But because I was from this kind of place where you were supposed to, you know, be accepting of everybody, but also, you know, fit into this suburban lifestyle, be normal, accept everyone, but be normal. I knew these things existed. I didn't know they existed for me. That's something I think a lot about with regard to representation. And, you know, we can do our best to represent a range of identities and we can hope that teens find something they need in the pages of our books, that they see themselves or part of themselves, and that maybe seeing that it'll help them in their own lives come to terms, if that's something they have to do, with their own identities. But there is the separation between how much the reader connects with the material, how much they internalize it. And I think this also relates to the political aspects too, of, you know, is somebody going to read this and think, oh, this is just a nice story? Or are they going to look at the political aspects and say, gee, this is something I really want to take into my life. I want to, you know, attend a protest, or I want to run for student body president and specifically talk about our school's homophobia problem.
You know what's interesting, as you were sort of explaining that, I don't know what made me think of this. Go with me on this, y'all. But I kept thinking of Kurt Hummel from Glee, and I know that this is like, just go with me on this train of thought. But, you know, Glee as a show, we could talk about Glee as a show all day if we want to. But the Kurt character was the first time for me that I saw somebody on screen that I was like, I get what's happening here. And when he came out so early in the first season, it was this big deal for him to be out. And then it was an even bigger deal to give him a boyfriend in the next season. And it was something that felt like a political statement, because that's how the media framed it and in talking about it. Yet it meant so much to me. And that was around the time that I I was coming out as gay, and I had graduated high school. I graduated college. I was in grad school. Like, I was a full ass adult, and I was like, oh, now I'm actually like able to process those bits of myself. So even something like a show with or like a book with just like fluffy representation can sometimes be the change also. I don't know. What do you think, Camryn?
I feel like certain books can also, like, if it changes an industry, if that makes sense. Like I think about Aristotle and Dante, and how that was like such a big deal, I feel like. And I feel like inspired a lot of queer writers to write like explicitly queer stories. And like also showed publishing that it could be like marketable and that people would buy it and things like that. And I definitely think about Glee too. Like, it was a disaster, but I think a lot of shows, either in a good way or a bad way, like took cues from it in terms of like their queer characters and including it like it wasn't a big deal. So I'm not sure if necessarily I this might be idealistic, but I do feel like those things do change the world, even if just a little bit. For me, Santana and Glee was such a big deal for me. And Santana and Brittany, and then the fan fiction and all of that was so important for me. And I know for so many other people too. So I think those changes and those impacts are super important.
I think like the message here is like representation matters, and just being able to see queer characters experiencing a wide array of, of difficulties, of dreams, of ambitions is meaningful. And that in and of itself, just the fact that we're all here and we wrote queer books, and there's, more and more queer stories out there every single year, I think that matters. And hopefully young readers will be able to walk into a bookstore and find not just one, because I agree, like Kurt Hummel for me was like the character, and he was like someone that spoke to me, and like the first time I ever saw myself, and it was great. It was cathartic, but it was also kind of sad that he was the only character that was available to me. So I think it's really special that now there are many, many different characters across many different, identities and experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think in answer to the original question, I would say both, and yes, and in terms of everything we're talking about, like, yes, like all the power of art, the importance of art in creating change, I think is so important, and it's all together. It's books, it's film, it's music, it's everything. It's nonfiction. And I mean, I don't know, Like a Love Story talks about this a lot. There's a running theme in there of like the power of the arts to create change and also to create connection, the importance. I know in my like coming of age, and I think I've largely deduced that I'm the oldest person here by your, mostly from your relationship to Glee, maybe. I'm like, wow. But, one thing Like a Love Story talks about quite a bit is like the way that, queer icons and queer language connected a community. And a lot of that was like, it was done in code. And that's the era I grew up in. And like, I was a 10-year-old growing up in the suburbs from a Middle Eastern family who had no exposure to queer life at all, who somehow at the age of 10 became obsessed with like Joan Crawford, Judy Garland, Madonna I was already obsessed with, like Rita Hayworth, like name a gay icon, and I somehow became obsessed with them as a 10-year-old, not knowing they were gay icons. And then when I like finally realized what being gay even was, and that there was a gay community, and I was like, wait, you all love these people too? Like, how did I even find them? Like, what is this thing? What is this thing called art that somehow like communicates to us in ways that we don't even understand? Like, I mean, that's everything I care about. Like, I think absolutely art can change culture, and culture changes art, and it's a constant dialogue.
Absolutely. I just want to say Madonna is to Like a Love Story as Mariah Carey is to Can't Take That Away. And I think our books are sisters. And I had to just
I love that. And I love Mariah too. And I love that there was like the hint of a collaboration that Mariah like talked about in her book, right?
Yeah, there was like this this like little kernel of something maybe
Why did
potentially.
that not happen?
I don't know.
That's another panic.
But I love what you said just about like, especially like queer people, like, you know, I guess finding themselves in these icons, because, you know, the lack of representation, that's something that really resonated with me growing up in the 90s. So I'm gonna ask one final question, and I'm gonna bring this up that I got this email the other day, and I'm just gonna read it. I'm gonna read part of it. I am a non-binary high schooler. Like Carrie, I am a songwriter, a poet, and an actor, and I'm dealing with depression. I have never felt so seen as today when I read Can't Take That Away. I'd been feeling down on myself recently, doubting whether I was really valid or important. Then I chanced upon your book, and Carrie, the first genderqueer protagonist I've read about, and their story resonated with me. They reminded me that who I am matters, that my identity and experiences matter. And part of the reason why I write is to tell my own story and my own experiences and to get that down, but to also tell stories out there for people, not even teens, but obviously teens, that they can resonate with, that it can show you that you're not alone in the world and that who you are matters. So my last question for you all is, why do you write the stories that you write?
I think for me, like, two reasons, and I think they're similar to yours. Like, the first is I write for myself. I write because it's cathartic and it's the way that I understand myself, and it's the way that I have to understand how I interact with my world. And also, like, that message, that's so lovely, and that you received. And I've also been receiving messages similar to that over the past couple of weeks. And there's something so special and just so, I don't know, that warms my heart so much to know that the story, as much as I wrote it for myself, it is reaching the right readers and it is making people feel seen. And that, you know, it may have not necessarily been why I wrote book one, but it's certainly a reason I have to continue writing and to continue telling stories that feel honest to me and that I know other people will resonate with.
Yeah, I basically will say the same thing, where I write primarily for myself, but I think knowing how other books have impacted me, knowing that, or hoping that my book will impact others in the same way. Hopefully someone reads my books and feels the same way I felt when I read Miseducation of Camryn Post.
The interesting thing for me, and I alluded to this earlier, is I generally start with politics. I generally start with the message that I want to impart, which usually is just that queerness and trans identities are valid. And also particularly in the Unpopular Vote, that, yeah, this world sucks a lot of the time. And there are a lot of social systemic issues that need to be addressed. And I wanted to convey the message that those things are not inevitable. They are not set in stone. They are social constructs. They are things that we can work together to try to overhaul. And so, I mean, as we've been talking about, I do believe that art is a tool for social change. And I write with that in mind. I write to try and, you know, do my own bit of activism. But what's interesting is I also really do need to be writing for myself or else it doesn't work. And so The Unpopular Vote is a book that is very dear to my heart for a lot of reasons. It's sort of about my hometown. It's it's got these characters that I have a long relationship with, because this is not the first time I tried to write a book about them. And so it's a book that really ended up being for teen me, despite the fact that I didn't think it was when I started writing it. And yeah, like I mentioned, that other book that I worked on where I tried to convey what this, this message that I thought was really important, but I wasn't writing it for me, and it didn't work. So yeah, so basically same thing you've all said, got to write for yourself, but having a message is important too.
Yeah, definitely it's a version of the same thing for me. I mean, I primarily work in film and TV, and I was a screenwriter for about 10 years before I started writing books. And I would say one of my biggest frustrations, and I do love film and TV, but it's very hard to get certain stories told. And I did write a lot of scripts that were about Iranian characters and many times queer Iranian characters, and they just wouldn't be the ones that got made. And I think especially around the time I had children, I felt this like deep desire to do writing that was more honest and to at least have a few things I put out in the world that I could like give to them and say like, this is me. And, you can read this and see who I am and what my values are. So I think it definitely comes, it's a little bit like that Toni Morrison quote that I feel like most of us probably have heard, but it's, if there's a book that you want, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And I knew that, beyond the fact that I wanted to do honest writing, I also never felt represented, which doesn't mean that I'm approaching my books from a political place, but it just means that I know that I felt lonely not having any stories about queer Middle Eastern people out there to guide me. And I felt like, well, if I could tell this honest story that serves me in this cathartic process of, self-discovery, it'll probably serve others. Because I don't know, I feel like the more I live, the more I realize like no one's that unique. If there's a story you need, chances are many other people need it too. And that's part of the beauty of creation.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And so on my last note, I want to sort of reframe things a little bit, because, and I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for anybody else, but I'm not writing political stories. I'm writing stories about humans. I'm writing stories about people. I'm writing stories about my experiences. If people out there perceive them to be political, then that's on you. But I'm writing stories to tell, to show the world that I live in. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's filled with joy. And sometimes it's somewhere in between. So I just want to thank each and every one of you, Camryn, Daniel, Jasper, Abdi, for being here today. Really, really appreciate it. Where can readers find more about you, follow you, support you?
You can find me at danielaleman.com or on Twitter at Dan_Aleman.
I'm at CamrynGarrett.com or on Twitter at Dancing with Pens.
You can find me at Abdaddy everywhere. I'm mostly on Instagram, but I am Abdaddy on Instagram, Twitter, and abdaddy.com.
It's a great name.
Thank you.
You can find me at jaspersanchez.com or on Instagram at JR_Sanchez. I'm also on Twitter, but not as often.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am Steven Salvatore. Thank you for joining us at Pride Book Fest 2021. Woo!